welcome to the 13th Sustainability Lunchtalk. As usual, this Lunchtalk is recorded and will be uploaded on the Sustainability webpage in the coming days. Please be aware that we will not take questions during the presentation, as a dedicated Q&A moment will take place at the end. If your question pops up during the talk, feel free to write it in the chat and we will pass it to the host. My name is Mathieu Gilleron. I'm project manager in sustainability for the University of Luxembourg. With my colleague Laurent, one of our mission is to raise awareness on sustainability among the community. To help us, we have the chance to be surrounded by brilliant experts from teaching, research, and administration. And today we are happy to welcome Professor Christian Schulz from the Faculty of Humanities, Education and Social Science, and Dr. Anthony Lepinteur from the same faculty to talk about post-growth economies. So, if I remember my first economy class from back in high school, the GDP was the first indicator we would learn. And the first calculation you learn was the growth rate. At that time, I was very happy because I could finally understand the radio show I was listening to with my parents. I was able to argue with them and kind of feel intelligent. To be honest, at that time, it was okay. I was okay with that vision. GDP growth sounded good for a 15-year-old. I would be able to buy stuff, go on vacation, and be happy. And then I started realizing that GDP was actually, and growth rate were actually the only indicators we would hear. In class, we would learn about the HDI, Human Development Index, but mostly to say it was not perfect. We would talk a bit about sustainable development, but once again, it was just an appendix. More intriguing, I started realizing that even though we had a sort of GDP growth, the world didn't seem to be a better place. Actually, it's the opposite if we compare it with social indicators like poverty rate or median salary. It's even worse when compared with environmental indicators. Indeed, before 1944 and the famous Bretton Woods Conference that would lead to the use of GDP as the #1 indicator of development, the accumulated emissions of CO2 were around 200 billions of tons. After 1944, it's around 1,300 billions. I know we shouldn't take shortcuts. The world is much more complicated than just numbers and ratios. But before leaving the floor, I would like to quote Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, who said in 2022 during the Stockholm Plus 50 international meeting, "We must place true value on the environment and go beyond GDP as a measure of human progress and well-being. Let us not forget that when we destroy a forest, we are creating GDP. When we overfish, we are creating GDP. GDP is not a way to measure richness in the present situation in the world." Our host for this lunch talk will be Dr. Christian Schulz. He's an economic geographer from the Faculty of Humanities, Science and Humanities, Education and Social Science. He's actually the head of the Department of Geography and Spatial Planning. His research focuses on sustainability, transition, and regional development. Our co-host for the day is Dr. Anthony Lepinteur. He will moderate this talk. He is research associate at the Department of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences. His most recent publications explore the interplays between labor market reforms, subjective well-being, and individual behaviors. Sorry, Anthony. We are very excited to have them both today. And without further ado, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. And also thank you, Laurent, for putting this together. Let me just for 1 second share with you my slides. Can you see them full screen? Perfect, great. Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. So my name is Anthony Lepinteur, research scientist at the University of Luxembourg. And so yes, by training, I actually am an economist, 100% an economist. Since even high school, actually, I started studying economics in high school. But I am working at the Department of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences because I think I'm actually not quite a classic economist, in the sense that I've been studying a lot topics that are not classic for economists, in the sense that I've been working on the economics of happiness, for instance, what makes people happy. And one of the topics that we studied the most in our field is actually economic growth. What is the impact of economic growth? Is economic growth satisfying as a measure of societal progress? And so here, just going to follow up on what Mathieu just said, when economists, we talk about economic growth, this starts in high school, but it also follows up until, you know, high school to university, PhD, whatever the level you can think about. When we think about economic growth, we think about the rise in the GDP, the gross domestic product. And in practice, economists and policymakers, we actually like the GDP. We believe it is a measure of progress because indeed it represents the potential for consumption of the country. And as economists, we have been trained to believe that the higher the consumption, the happier we are as a population. And also the GDP has some, let's say, attractive features. It can be computed on a regular basis, which will allow you as a policymaker or as a researcher to make evolution over time. You can say, are we doing better? Are we doing worse over time? And it's also universal. The way we compute the GDP in Luxembourg is the same as the way we compute the GDP in Germany, in France. So you can compare the GDP across countries. So again, for researchers and policymakers, the GDP is a powerful tool. And this is why we have been so much accustomed to use, the GDP as a measure of progress. But it goes without saying, Mathieu already mentioned it, the GDP is far from being perfect. What about negative externalities? Pollution. If a firm is very productive and creating a lot of jobs, but at the same time is destroying a forest or polluting a lake, can we really believe that the growth in GDP represents progress? Definitely not. Something that maybe to complement what Mathieu said, another thing that the GDP does not take into account are all activities, all exchanges that are not the object of a market, that are not the object of a transaction with money involved. So everything that is linked to domestic work, benevolent work, all of these things contribute to our societal well-being, to progress, and yet the GDP fails to take them into account. So here I'm completely on board with you, Mathieu, when it comes to raise this question, is GDP really the road that we want to follow? So this is from a theoretical perspective. This is from a measurement perspective. Here, I would like to bring you my point, my perspective, the perspective of someone that has been working on the economics of happiness. So as I've told you before, the economics of happiness, its main objective is to understand what are the determinants of happiness, what makes people happy. And to do so, we use this very standard question, for instance, on a scale of 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life, all things considered? And we use these kind of measures that we combine to data sets with thousands or even millions of observations, and we try to understand how can we understand what makes people happy. And one of the first paper, actually the first paper that has been produced in this field was in 1974 by Richard Easterlin. And Richard Easterlin, back in the days, wrote a paper about economic growth. And he asked the question, does economic growth improve the human lot? Some empirical evidence. And spoiler alert, it does not. Economic growth doesn't make us happier. And here, just to give you an example, this comes from a paper published by Andrew Clark and some co-author in 2008. You can see the evolution with the dashed line, the evolution of income per capita in the US from the 70s to the early 2000s. And you can see that overall, the long-term trend is quite positive. We are in a period of economic prosperity. And still, happiness, the black line, is completely flat. So economic growth does not correlate with better well-being, with higher well-being. And this is not only about the US. You also have the same flat line for European countries, for 5 European countries. And more recently, Richard Easterlin with Kelsey O'Connor, who is an economist based in Luxembourg, they confirmed that actually there is no relationship between GDP and happiness everywhere. And this is one of the key findings behind the Easterlin paradox. So just in short, and I'm about to give the floor to Christian, but if you think about it, economic growth, we know that it's costly. that it fails to account for important measures, and at the same time, it does not even contribute to national happiness. So I think today, more than ever, there is this pressing need to discuss post-growth models. We need to find post-growth models that are compatible with well-being, that are compatible with sustainability. And here, I'm in a very comfortable position because, you know, I'm raising the question, I'm asking the questions. Now I'm going to leave the floor to Christian, who is going to, I'm sure, give us some insight about these post-growth models. Can we think about it? Please, Christian, the floor is yours. Christian, I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that. I was saying thank you, Anthony, for paving the way and for buying me some time, as I won't have to explain GDP limitations in detail. And thank you to Mathieu and Laurent for having me and for bringing up this topic in the Lunch Talk series. What I won't start with graphs or indicators, but I come back to them certainly in a minute. I'd start by this random example of something that shows there's something going on in the corporate world which goes beyond ongoing discussions on the green economy, efficiency gains, and the like. This seems to be something more fundamental if a international corporation such as Patagonia warns us to buy their product. And one could assume this is a maybe clever marketing idea for their outdoor garment. But if you have a closer look at this advertisement, we see behind that there's a package of repair and maintenance services offered to the clients, including a lifelong warranty for their products. And you probably also heard that the founder and former owner of Patagonia, he gave his shares to a trust that in the future will make sure that all the benefits of Patagonia that are not reinvested into the firm will go to climate mitigation projects. So a very much impact and purpose-oriented cooperation, which we find in other sectors as well. I take it as a random example to start my claim by saying that post-growth oriented activities are or have come far beyond the niche status of small local initiatives in the field of urban farming, for example, which is frequently quoted and often ridiculized as being too marginal to have any particular impact. What I'm planning to do over the next 25 minutes or so is to summarize in a nutshell the essence of growth criticism. We heard parts of it already. I will then introduce the notions of post-growth and degrowth to you. This won't be too conceptual and too abstract, don't be afraid. Before I come to a series of examples from various sectors to indicate what's going on and what the transformative potentials of those activities might be. Before I conclude on a couple of challenges and maybe avenues for action, in particular in a short or midterm perspective. Growth criticism we can summarize as follows. It's the recognition of the social and ecological impacts of the capitalist economic system, the so-called externalities, as economists would probably put it. There's a raising awareness, globally speaking, that the promise of trickling down, the promise that a rising GDP would lift all boats, as Kennedy put it once, doesn't fully apply, or even worse, in many also Western industrialized countries, the gap between those parts of society profiting from GDP growth and those not profiting or even suffering from GDP growth is widening. We heard about GDP as a very limited kind of indicator for progress, and parts of the growth criticism is around this overrating of GDP as something to measure progress and well-being. I come back to this later on. We also see that former attempts to green the economy, to make the economy more sustainable, starting at the latest in the 1980s in the Western countries at least. Buzzwords such as green economy, sustainable growth, smart growth, or others, they essentially adhere to the growth paradigm, and they come with the promise that technological change, technological advances will allow us to continue to perpetuate our lifestyles without changing too much. So more or less business as usual models with incremental change, which that's the promise, do no harm to anyone. And behind that narration, we can now decipher that the promise of decoupling seems to be a myth. By decoupling, I mean the assumption that with technological progress, efficiency gains in the energy and resource consumption sector, GDP growth might uncouple from resource use. In absolute terms, that meaning the economy can grow further without further extracting resources from our natural environment, with all the social effects coming with that. This decoupling idea, this decoupling hypothesis, kind of can be empirically falsified if you look at those global numbers going back to the 1970s. If you look at the two upper lines of that graph, you see the GDP evolution worldwide with the reference year 1970 in inflation effects included. And we have the material consumption very much correlating with this curve. There is kind of a relative decoupling in the sense of the green line for material consumption being or rising a bit at a slower pace than GDP, even though there were periods where they were very much in parallel. Some observers even assume that in the near future there might be a recoupling between material consumption and GDP. We can come back to this in discussion if you like. What you also see in this graph is that population growth, globally speaking, has an impact on material consumption, undoubtedly, but it doesn't correlate as directly as one might think. So the overall driver for material and resource consumption seems to be continued economic growth as we measure it in GDP. This is the last graph I'm going to show for today, as I'm not an economist. And I'd like to continue by trying to avoid a very frequent misunderstanding. Very often when people hear post-growth or degrowth for the first time, and this includes policymakers or journalists, the immediate reaction is, oh, this means the opposite of growth, in the sense of being something negative, like an economic recession, a population that shrinks, urban decline, brownfields, or the like. This is not meant by degrowth or post-growth. It's not degrowing for the sake of reducing the economic performance, if you like, in GDP terms. It's rather an attempt to overcome the inherent growth logics of capitalism we heard about earlier, and it goes beyond the question of resources, finite resources, obviously setting limits to continued growth, theoretically and practically. It goes beyond that, as it is to be understood as a more general critique of growth being a political objective in itself in our current predominating capitalist economic system. It very much addresses questions of injustices, distributional injustices of wealth, externalities, social and ecological, as we heard before. And degrowth can probably be best translated into a search for a model that assures prosperity without material growth, or the search, as Mazzucato put it, a purpose-oriented economy. I know about the trickiness of purpose, and but it's associated with a qualitative attribute, which is a common good orientation, a purpose that serves the society as a whole, and not only certain interest groups or those profiting more than others from economic growth. Or to put it differently, hitherto efforts around the green economy and so forth, they very much focused on efficiency gains, technological fix approach, if you like, at best aimed for consistency, like recent examples in the field of circular economy, where one tries to close resource loops and to make the economy less extractive. Those two approaches, efficiency and consistency, essentially discuss the how of how we produce, how we organize production, how we transport things, how we consume. And they don't ask the question brought up by the idea of sufficiency, which is more around the what we produce and why or for which purpose we produce certain goods. Here, another disclaimer or another frequent misunderstanding: sufficiency often connotated negatively in the sense of claiming for self-restriction, overly responsibilizing individual consumers and the like. Sufficiency more to be understood, a discussion about the necessity of certain developments and evolutions. I will come up with a couple of practical examples in a few moments. Those examples can be found in what Alan Wright once called real utopias or nowtopias. This is not something hypothetical for the future or remote utopias we should strive for. This is something already happening within the current capitalist system. And that's probably something else to underline before I go on, that I'm not here, or the degrowth community and scholarship does not claim to have the fully fledged answer or the fully fledged alternative to the capitalist system, unlike very much suspected by more conservative policymakers and the media. It's more about searching for ways to overcome all the negative aspects of the capitalist system we talked about earlier, and to overcome in particular these inherent growth mechanisms. So nowtopias are really utopias in the sense of current practices that have the potential to illustrate how post-growth economies in the long run could be organized or could look like. I will talk you through a couple of those sectors just briefly, and in the discussion we may have time to go into further detail. It starts by rethinking the production process and essentially around the notion of how to dematerialize production. Coming back to the jacket presented at the beginning, repair, maintenance, the lifespan, the longevity of products can be a first attempt towards lowering the resource consumption in our production system. More sophisticated, probably what's called product service systems or integrated product service systems, where you don't buy a product, but where you buy a product in a package with a long-term maintenance scheme, be it for cars, household devices, for other things, where in such a scheme, the owner and the service provider offering you this package has a very strong interest in the longevity of those products. We talked about circular economy earlier, and the sharing economy, another buzzword in this context, often misunderstood or misinterpreted or misused, if I may. If you think, I'm thinking here of the properly sharing in the sense of being transformative, in the sense of reducing material and energy throughput. There's a lot of businesses calling themselves sharing in the sector of car sharing, Airbnb and others, those so-called platform economies, which pretend being based on sharing, but which contain all the negative impacts of extractive capitalist business models, like in other sectors. So when mentioning sharing here, I think of those sharing attempts that actually lead to lower resource consumption. Degrowth is very much about how firms or businesses at large are organized and what the ownership structure looks like. It's obvious that a small local energy cooperative has another decision-making power than the department of a large multinational corporation. Often those so-called community economies or community-driven economies or social businesses come with a variety of social innovations, for example, in the realm of how decisions are made how internal democracies organize the notion of sociocracy as a quite sophisticated social innovation is about to reach mainstream debates in organizational theory and elsewhere, and probably also impact the so-called mainstream economy. So it's about how people work together. It's also about how people work in the first place and how much people work in the first place and what is considered being work or labor. So the discussion we heard about in Anthony's teaser already about paid and unpaid labor, care work, volunteering, and other activities which are constitutive to the well-being of our societies, not at all taken into account in the conventional monitoring systems and indicators such as GDP. The way how we organize work and how we distribute our time in terms of wage labor and unpaid labor may have implications on how our work environment looks like. You see in this picture a random example of a co-working space with an associated childcare facility, allowing parents to work by being next to their children. So it may have implications on the physical infrastructures, on urban planning, the built environment in more general terms. We heard about indicators and their limitations, and this discussion is by no means a new one, and it goes back to the early stages of the GDP use, and it took off in the 1960s, 70s with alternative indicators we heard about already and gained a bit more traction over the last 15 years or so, particularly with the OECD, the EU, and others presenting alternative wealth indicators going beyond GDP fixation, being more complex, and by their complexity being apparently not viable in the political and mediatic realm. They are not so easy to quote. They need some more knowledge to understand composite indicators, and probably a bit different from that, the recent donut economy approach, which through its visualization, this very accessible visualization probably could be a means to convey the message of composite indicators, evaluating both social and ecological impacts of our economy. If you like, we can come back to this, just to mention that Luxembourg itself introduced quite a few years ago already an alternative wealth indicator, the PI Bien-être. And despite this nice playing with words, it hasn't made it to the national news too often in the past. So it's far from being as acknowledged as the GDP. Post-growth or degrowth, by the way, I'm using those two terms interchangeably for this talk because there is no consensus around how to distinguish the one from the other. It very much depends on the linguistic context you are in. Degrowth, internationally speaking, the probably most established of the two terms. There's some authors making a distinction between degrowth being the trajectory and post-growth being the imaginary for the future. So with a degrowth path, we can reach eventually a post-growth future, but not everybody would share this definition, which I like a lot. But for keeping it simple, I use the two terms interchangeably, like many other authors do. It includes, obviously, individual lifestyles, consumption patterns, sharing from another side, using sharing facilities like a makerspace in the example illustrated here. Sobriété heureuse, as the French say, might have another meaning in the English language, and more being for former alcoholics. So happy sufficiency would probably be the most appropriate term here. Having time for do-it-yourself, repair, gardening, and other activities as a non-paid and non-GDP eligible activity comes into play here. And finally, the role of finance. I don't have the time to go into detail, just to mention that here, besides the mainstream debate around green and sustainable finance, quite present in Luxembourg as well, there's also a more post-growth oriented part of that industry, which is again very frequently community-based, local or regional citizen banks, social banks, non-profit oriented banks, regional currencies, crowdfunding for local transition processes or the like are kind of emerging and gaining importance, as we could see in ongoing research projects in our realm. To summarize, we can observe a couple of obvious drivers for a change towards a post-growth orientation, very much bound to individuals, to single firms, single collectives, communities who try to change something, be it in the corporate sector or in the civil society sector. Obviously, with coming with a kind of value change amongst those protagonists. So it's not only external environmental and social imperatives forcing them to change practices, it's also the recognition that maybe other than material values might be given priorities. And as I said earlier, social innovations can be a driver here when it comes to the reorganization of formerly profit-oriented firms in more collective or community-based endeavors, including the governance and democracy part of it. And at the same time, we have a couple of persisting barriers which are quite powerful and partly systemic if you think of monetary policy or the like, things you can't easily change and which are part of a very fragile, if you like, economic, capitalist economic institutional context. There's a variety of misleading incentives still applying that rather foster growth-oriented activities than degrowth-oriented activities, and they foster growth for the sake of growth, independent of what actually is produced, for whom, and for what purpose. And we heard about the so-called regrettables included in the GDP, like wars, natural hazards, or the like, which can be quite detrimental to our societies, but very positive in GDP terms. We certainly have a lack of regulation in certain parts, and I will give examples for that in a few seconds. And it always comes back to what we, and Anthony also addressed earlier, our narrow understanding of what's the economy and what's labor. If we only consider the formalized firm doing market transactions in a capitalist system, being eligible to GDP monitoring and paying for work, if we only consider this part of our economy being the economy, then our understanding is very limited, and also our recognition of transformative changes in and around this economy may be limited from the very beginning. And this immediately comes back to the notion of how we monitor and how we measure progress, as Anthony indicated it at the beginning. So let me finally conclude or join or start and launch a discussion by some thoughts around how one can overcome what I would call, for want of a better term, unwanted growth. How do we want to avoid growth in sectors that are obviously detrimental to, in social or ecological terms? By the way, degrowth, as I said earlier, it's not the opposite of growth, and it deliberately includes growth in areas where growth is either regionally unavoidable and an imperative. So no degrowth scholar would say that no region in the world should grow any longer. It's more about redistribution and rebalancing growth trajectories, globally speaking, but also sectorally speaking, in the sense of which areas should grow. For example, renewable energies over fossil energies could be a qualitative debate around the purpose of growth. So to use a slogan of the degrowth movement, degrowth by design is better than degrowth by disaster. We shouldn't wait until the moment where we have no choice but to degrow, but we should more proactively think about degrowing. And besides the initiatives I illustrated earlier as examples, and this definitely wasn't exhaustive, I want to focus, in this conclusion, I want to focus on the role of the state, which I only marginally addressed so far, because I think that in the short and midterm, perspective, state agency will be key and will be the only means to accelerate processes which obviously are too slow, as we saw in the chart with the ever-growing material consumption in relation to GDP, and if you like, the failure of green economy and other approaches to absolutely decouple material consumption from GDP. To accelerate this process of decoupling, apparently other means are necessary than voluntary initiatives taken by community, by certain pioneering firms. And amongst the levers we can identify in our work where the state could act rather immediately and change things probably fundamentally. I start with incentives and subsidies already addressed. Think of the agriculture sector, things of hidden or non-hidden subsidies for the use of cars, the purchase of more powerful cars, the electronic vehicles not necessarily being a post-growth-oriented solution. If you think of all the new implications coming with e-mobility, lithium extraction, battery recycling, and so on and so forth. And amongst subsidies, obviously, the taxation system, and it's not a new debate about whether resources shouldn't be given priority in the taxation over labor being taxed. Current system and many of the negative implications of overconsumption, overproduction are simply due to the fact that labor is, for labor, we pay more taxes than for the use of resources. And it probably should be the other way around. And if you think in repair logics that labor is needed to repair and to maintain, an inverted taxation logic here could be a very important driver. Nobody prevents the state, and by state I mean municipalities, the national states, but also international organizations such as the EU, from thinking about more restrictive product standards in areas where the evolution, the development of a certain industry has become particularly detrimental. We have regulation in many areas, and we probably have too little regulation in others. And the example I used to give here is the famous, and maybe it's a bit blunt, but the famous SUV becoming larger and heavier with every new model series. And instead of thinking about any limits to that material growth, if you like, of that particular product, by state regulation, we start thinking about adapting the norms of multi-story parkings to those new cars, or widening parking lots in the public space, and by that limiting even further the car-free areas in our cities. So there's something where, and this is admittedly a blunt example, but it's probably very telling. And finally, we already addressed that, the way how we measure and what kind of indicators we use to define goals, policy goals in the short and the long-term perspective. Here, GDP is more than anachronistic, if you like. So by that, I'd like to finish by saying that the state, with those and other measures, could create reliable institutions which are definitely necessary for firms to adapt, for firms to make investment decisions. In the long term, we see that in climate change policies, where firms desperately ask for more regulation and binding international frameworks that allow them to plan for the next 1, 2, or more decades. The same might apply to other areas than CO2 reduction. And moreover, I think we need a more honest debate that doesn't come with the promise of a business as usual practice, as we see it quite frequently in the debates around green economy and so forth. I leave it here. For further information, feel free to drop me an email or look at our open access publication you'll find under the link indicated here, and I'm sure the organizers will will make these slides available for you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much for this very important talk and also very informative. I learned so many things. So before giving you a couple of comments and questions, let me remind the audience that now this is the time for the discussion. We have about 15 minutes. So if you want, you can just write your question in the chat, or I guess you can also maybe raise your virtual hand and then we'll find a way to give you, to unmute your mic. So before going to the question of the audience, Christian, let me say that there is one thing I would like to highlight in your presentation that for me was extremely important, is that post-growth or degrowth is not the opposite of economic growth. Because every year with my students, when we talk about, the Easterlin paradox, economic growth, happiness are disconnected, and I always have this question of, yes, but what if we abandon economic growth? And, degrowth becomes the opposite of economic growth. And this doesn't work either when you think about just the economics of happiness. In happiness, we know that people compare, they compare to other people. So what if I engage in a sort of degrowth process and then my neighbors don't do it, or Luxembourg does it, but Germany don't do it? That would not work because we are going to compare each other. We also adapt and we also think about who we were in the past. So if I used to be rich and if you ask me tomorrow to be less rich, this is also difficult, to make people accept this future. And the same goes with expectations. We know that people not only compare with each other, they compare themselves with the past, but they also compare themselves with what they believe they will have in the future. So if you tell them, let's go on a road where you're going to get poorer, then this is going to, everybody's going to say no to degrowth if it's the opposite of economic growth. So thank you very much for making it clear that it's much more sophisticated, much more complicated, that there is a project that is promising behind the post-growth models. So here for you, just very quick questions. The first one is about, if I think we all agree upon the fact in this room that we want to move towards these post-growth models. And you mentioned some orientations, like practical orientations, but they were more taken at the individual/business level. And then at the end of the presentation, you mentioned the role of the states. And throughout your presentation, I was always thinking about the states. Like, who do you think should lead the way? Should it be the individual and then create, a sort of force that policymakers would acknowledge for, and then they would put forward some regulations to favor post-growth models? Or should it be the other way around? Like, shall we expect first governments, and maybe some governments already started? Like, do you have some intakes about who should lead the way?
Mm-hmm. So my assumption is that a post-growth transition is nothing that will happen from the top down, in the sense of a state having an idea how to sort out things and imposing a post-growth policy. This would immediately lead to reactions that are far from being open and sympathetic of degrowth, to say the least. And I think we, given the action of certain social movements in Europe and beyond, we got a taste of that if degrowth is wrongly communicated or badly communicated. I think if ever a post-growth transition can have success, it has to be a widely accepted democratic emancipatory project to which all the actor groups you mentioned should contribute. It's not about over-responsibilizing the sole consumer, nor is it to blame the economy and the corporate firms as being guilty, nor is it the role of the state alone. I finished on the role of the state because I thought it was neglected in other parts of the presentation, but it's not the sole lever we have. I think it's an interplay of all three, which makes it complicated.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I can see forces and, being an economist, game theory going all over the place. But yeah, this is complicated. I have a couple of questions coming from the chat, so I'm going to move to these questions. I'm going to read out loud everything, Christian, so that you have the context. So from Susan Siebentrit, you make the contrast between degrowth and green economy / technological solution, and say that green economy doesn't work so far, but maybe it does. Numbers from the first months of 2024 indicate that 2023 may be the year that marks the maximum of CO2 emissions worldwide because of the growth of renewable energies, a technological solution. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, do we have time to change capitalism? Don't we have to embrace the technological solutions?
Thank you. Thank you, Susanne, for the question, which is pertinent and which gives me the opportunity to argue in a bit more differentiated manner than going over the green economy quite brutally earlier. It's not an either-or decision. What I was saying is that the green economy efforts so far, they have had positive effects, undoubtedly, in many areas, and we saw a relative decoupling in the graph I showed. By the way, mistrust any of those graphs you see for single national economies. A lot of countries and also scholars in the world who try to prove that the UK, for example, has absolutely decoupled resource consumption from economic growth. This is, for the vast majority of cases, this is only due to relocalization of activities to other countries, not taken into account in those statistics. That's why I prefer using the global numbers here. Coming back to your question, Susanne, what I wanted to say is that in addition, and this was part of this graph where I contrasted efficiency, consistency with sufficiency. In addition to the form to efficiency, there's probably other means necessary to accelerate the transition. And if I got your the second part of your question correctly, we don't have the time to wait for the technological fix to save the world. And whenever there's a new kind of initiative, a new kind of buzzword, like the smart city approach or the recent renaissance of nuclear energy worldwide or the like, whenever those promises are made, I'm becoming overly skeptical that those single sector or single-sided measures can be the solution. So in addition to technological change, which is important and which plays a very, very important role, in particular in the realm of energy, we need more and other actions. And those actions include the recognition of the impossibility of a business as usual scenario. So it always comes with a combination of technological change, but also change of routines in terms of consumption or production patterns. I think that's the point the degrowth approach makes in contrast to the others, or is more honest in this regard by saying we have to be a bit more humble in the sense of how we can solve the issue, and it's not through technological advances alone that we will do it.
Thank you. I'm going now to I'm going to read you two questions at a time because there is one from Dimitri, another one from Laurent, and I think they somehow relate to the same topic. So I will read you everything and then we'll give you the floor for a response. So I'm starting with Dimitri. How would the described post-growth practices be applicable for developing economies? In other words, would developing economies be able to enter the post-growth period while somehow skipping the growth period that the currently developed economies have gone through? Is it possible for developing economies to engage in degrowth by design? And Laurent, add to this, what is your view about the much needed economic growth of global South countries? Is degrowth / post-growth much more concern for our rich Western countries where equipment rate is at the maximum?
Okay, thank you. Great questions. I try to give two answers which are kind of intertwined. The one I addressed earlier, that degrowth is also about redistribution at the global level, but also within national economies. And by the way, the French décroissance school, which is kind of a pioneering school of thoughts dating back to André Gortz and others in the 1960s, 70s, it very much comes from development studies and very much comes from the debate around global injustices and extractive industries from the global north doing harm to other parts of the world. So in this sense, it from the very beginning had the interest to make sure that regions in, I don't like the term global south too much, but you know what it means, essentially, that those regions and countries should have should be given, that sounds quite colonial in a way, should be given the opportunity to grow. But the argument to say they should be allowed to grow the same way as industrial countries grew in the past, we can't forbid them to pursue the same trajectory, is a bit short-sighted in the sense of overlooking that many regions in the global south are further advanced, I would say, than the global north in searching for alternatives. And a lot of those social innovations I mentioned earlier, they actually come from the global south or come from global south region. If you think of microfinance, which has become quite a tool even in Western industrialized countries nowadays, it was developed to help the poorest of the poorest. It's a debatable and increasingly misused tool, microfinance, but its origins and the good faith it came with at the beginning, it emerged from countries in the global south. The discussion around local livelihoods, the discussion about repair, maintenance, and the like, I would say the global north can learn a lot from the global south, and it's not the other way around.
Thank you, Christian. Mathieu, if this is okay with you, I'm going to take one last question, one from Rachel. And this question actually brings us back to the role of the states. So let me read you the question. If we want to have reliable institutions, we would need policy coherence mechanisms and monitoring between all of their actions. If we want honest debates, we would need multi-stakeholder discussion fora that would not only debate, but also come up with transformative projects. But both policy coherence and multi-stakeholder fora are uncomfortable for the mainstream establishments. So how could policy make space for those mechanisms without fearing for their own advantage of power?
I'm tempted to copy-paste this comment as a starting point for a project proposal in the near future. No, it's precisely the questions at stake. And I would add a layer to this, which is the international dimension of it, because no single national state will be able to come up with fully fledged answers to all those questions. It needs international coordination and maybe starting within the EU. So I have no proper answer to that question, but to agree with you that these are the key points.
And I think this is actually almost the perfect point, to conclude and to think actually about what can be done in the future, how to think about all the actors at stake in this change. It's 1:25, so I think, Mathieu, now the discussion is over and I'm giving you the floor.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Thank you, Anthony, for your insight and answers and presentation on this topic. I wish it could last longer because it's very interesting and I think we just opened the field, so a lot of stuff to say. I invite you to read the book. So I will not lie, you gave it to me yesterday, so I didn't read it yet, but it's on my desk. Also the German one, but I have to practice my German before starting it. Thank you again. So the record will be available online. If you share with me the presentation, I will also make it available for the people to download. Before closing, I would like to invite you to our next Sustainability Lunchtalk, which will be the last one of the season. Complete different subject. I'll try to say it properly. It will be about monitoring and managing harmful cyanobacterial blooms in a changing world. If you have no clue what it means, then just wait for the summer to be back. Plan a picnic with your family and try to go to Esch-sur-Lake. And then when you will receive the official communication from the Ministry of Health saying you cannot dive in the lake, then you will start to understand what this topic is about. We will talk about the algae. So quite a summer topic, I would say. It will be presented by Dr. Jean-Baptiste Burnet from the LIST, together with Dr. Sylvia Venditti from the FSTM. And it's on July 3rd. You will receive the invitation. Don't forget to visit the sustainability webpage of the university to learn more about what we are doing at the university and what we try to implement at the university. You will also learn about, once again, the coming lunch talks and especially the next year lunch talk that we are planning, and that will be hopefully as interesting as the one from this year. and you can subscribe to our sustainability letter. Thanks a lot again. Have a nice day, and wish you all the best.